Open your Bible now to the book of Romans, to chapter 2 and verse 21. Romans chapter 2 and verse 21. And while you're turning there, this is a really powerful section that began back at chapter 2 and verse 1. Because Paul is now addressing the Jewish man and how he viewed himself, how he viewed his place. And verses 1 through 5 was addressing the hypocritical judgment, the way they looked at the Gentiles and the things that they were accusing the Gentiles of, they were guilty of themselves. In verses 6 through 16, addressed the heavenly judgment, the way God viewed all of this. You know, the way God looks at things is often very different than the way that man looks at things. And if you, by the way, if you're in our Monday morning Bible class tomorrow morning, we'll be studying 1 Samuel chapter 15 and 16. And you will observe, particularly chapter 16, that the Lord does not see as man sees. For how does man see? He looks on the outward. How does God see? He looks on the inward part of man. And so we'll discuss that tomorrow. But then you get to verses 17 through 29, and the focus will be on honest character. Am I who I say I am? Am I living the way God expects me to live? Well, let's begin first of all looking at verse 21. We've already talked about that, so let's look at verse 21 now. You therefore who teach another, do you not teach yourself? You who preach that a man should not steal, do you steal? Now, verse 22 goes along with this, but let's notice first of all, you therefore who teach another. Paul had just previously discussed how they looked at themselves. Do you look at yourselves as a light to the blind, as a guide to those who are in darkness? Do you view yourself as being the more knowledgeable one? If I know more than someone else, who is supposed to be the more responsible one? You are. Like, for instance, if you have an adult and an argument who get in, an adult and a child who get into an argument, who's the one supposed to know more? The adult is. Sometimes adults can act more childish than children. And quite often we would say, you ought to have known better. You should have had a better understanding. Well, here he says, you who teach another, do you not teach yourself? What is it that Paul is driving home right here? There's a very important point. Practice what you preach. And when you teach, you have to listen to what you yourself are teaching. You've heard people say, don't do as I say, do as I do. Well, let's look at some passages here. I think there's at least a couple that are valuable here. Let's go to the book of Matthew, chapter 23, and let's look at verses 3 and 4. Matthew 23 is the Lord's rebuke of the hypocrites. And that's the background behind what we're studying here in Romans chapter 2. He said in verses 3 and 4, therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do, but do not do according to their works. For they say and do not. For they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders. They themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. How likely are people to follow a person and say, all right, let's get busy in the work. You go do it, and I'll go to the office and sit and watch you. How well does that work? They want a leader. They want someone who shows them what to do and how to do it. Well, the Lord said, these scribes, these Pharisees, these hypocrites, they're not doing that. Well, let's go to another passage. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 27. In 1 Corinthians 9, Paul is talking about the role that he and Barnabas have had as teachers. And he's concerned that people see in them the kind of attitude, the kind of actions that a person who really loves the Lord has. And he said in verse 27, "But I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest that when I have preached to others, I myself should be disqualified." Who's the worst preacher in the world? Y'all can answer that question. It's the hypocrite. It's the person who gets up and tells you to live a certain life, and then he doesn't live it himself. And so the Jewish mind was, they looked at themselves as up here, as above the Gentiles, and they looked at themselves as saying, you guys are not living right. You guys are not following the wonderful law which God has given. But Paul said, but then you yourself, do you teach that a man should not steal, and do you steal? Now let's go ahead and take verse 22 with that. You who say do not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? Three things that Paul has in mind here that they were failing at. What kind of failures are we seeing here? Are y'all reading the same passage I'm reading? You got to respond now. This is an interactive class. What's that? Adultery, idolatry, but you go back to verse 21. Thieves, stealing, adultery, and idolatry. Now, are those three things that God has frequently dealt with the children of Israel and saying, you better not do this? Now, let me tie a couple of things together. I mentioned in my sermon this morning about Achan. What did Achan do? He disobeyed God. But do you remember the children of Israel, when they came in, the first city that they were commanded to destroy was Jericho. And God told them everything that was in Jericho was to be destroyed, to be devoted to him. But Achan said, in Joshua 7 and verse 20, he said, when I saw among the spoils, in other words, when we were there, we saw what was left, this wedge of gold and this silver and this Babylonian garment, he said, I coveted them and I took them. What did he do? He stole. Who did he steal from? God. Malachi chapter 3, he says, will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me. And they said, in what way have we robbed you? And in their case, they had tithes and offerings. Can a man rob God today? Yes, he can. It's, someone says, well, did he take money out of the plate? But can a man rob God by not putting money into the plate? I think that's probably more of the thievery, the robbing, than the person who would take money out. Because we tend to think one can be justified. And so you look here, he says, and you say, do not commit adultery. What is one of the most famous events before the children of Israel crossed over into the promised land? You remember Balak and Balaam? Balak hired Balaam to curse the children of Israel, and he couldn't do that. So what he did, he counseled and encouraged him. He says, what you need to do is put these loose women in the acacia grove right there before they cross. And what happened to the children of Israel? They all committed adultery. And when they committed adultery, God slew them. Adultery has been a serious thing throughout the history of Israel. And then he talks about, you who abhor idols, Do you rob temples? Now, here's an interesting passage. You may want to write this in the margin of your Bible. Let's go to the book of Deuteronomy. Let's go to chapter 7 and verses 25 and 26. There we read, you shall burn the carved images of God with fire. You shall not covet the gold or the silver that is on them, nor take it for yourselves, lest you be snared by it. For it is an abomination to the Lord your God, nor shall you bring an abomination into your house. Test you, lest you be doomed to destruction like it. You shall utterly detest it and utterly abhor it, for it is an accursed thing. God said, I don't want you to covet the gold or the silver that's on those idols. You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? Is it possible that the children of Israel were saying, well, I tell you what, I wouldn't have an idol, but I'll be glad to take the gold off of it or the silver off of it. And what he's doing here, these are Jewish people who are doing things that the Gentiles can see and they can know. Well, there's several other passages we could go there, but let's keep on verse 23. You who make your boast in the law, do you dishonor God through breaking the law? Now, you boast in the law. You say, we believe in the law, but when it comes to applying the law to yourselves, what are they doing? Ignoring it. And he says, in doing that, you dishonor the lawgiver, which is God. Now, if you're sitting there and you're hearing this as a Jew, how would this possibly be taken? Go over like a lead balloon. That's a good way to picture it. He is calling them out on the very things that they are guilty of. And, up to this point, as we observed last week, when you read chapter 1, particularly beginning with verse 18, going through verse 32, he's talking about the Gentile mind and the things they've done, and it's almost like, get them, let them have it, until it comes to us, and then it's like, now you've done gone to meddling. You start to deal with matters that apply to us. We want to hear it when someone else's sin is discussed. How do we want our sin exposed? Keep quiet. Don't say anything that might offend us. Well, he said, you are dishonoring God. Well, look. Yeah, it's, yeah. Well, I mean, similar statements are very true. But in other words, you take care of your own problems before you come and take care of mine. But the problem Paul is trying to say is everybody is in need of the gospel. And what he's doing, he's actually trying to lead the Jewish person to realize, you know what? I'm not living the way God wants. Let's go and take verse 24 with this. For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, as it is written. Notice, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Sometimes we may think it does not matter. But when a preacher, an elder, a deacon, a Bible class teacher, a prominent person commits sin, does it diminish the Lord's cause in the community? Yes. Pedophilia right now. Oh yeah, that they're guilty of it. Well, if I were to ask you, if you find a person who's a televangelist, what comes to your mind? Adultery? What? Yeah. Money? I think most of us, if we look at it, we watch 2/3 of the program is okay, here's our address. Send us money, send us money, send us money. And you tend to think it's all about enriching that person rather than in doing God's will. And then the other is the morality issue. Many of them have been caught in very immoral situations. And what does that do to the world when we're out trying to preach the gospel? They think we're all just a bunch of hypocrites. That's exactly right. That's a good illustration there. Dead flies give off an odor to the perfumers. Interesting, when we were in Cairo on one of our trips, we went into this perfumery. I guess that's the word. I'll make it up if it's not. Y'all know what I'm talking about anyway. It's a place where they make perfumes. And while we were there, they would have all these various things. Can you imagine opening up one of them and having a bunch of dead flies or dead stuff in it? And you go, ooh, that's not good. Well, that's the way that a person who is preaching God's message, the character of the messenger can often cause the message itself to be disrespected. That's a really good point. I appreciate that, Willie. So he's saying the God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. And Paul is saying what that's doing is that's hurting the cause of God as we try to reach out to the world. Now, does the church sometimes have to realize that the lives of the members, not just talking about the leadership, but the lives of the members can somehow reflect negatively? I'd suggest we need to take a very hard look at what we might post on social media. Because sometimes what we post may not look very good for us, may actually make us look bad. And then when we try to reach people with the gospel, they say, well, they're a bunch of mean, hateful old folks. Or they're a bunch of immoral folks. They don't have any better morals than anybody else does. Okay, well, let's pick up with verse 25 now. Verses 25 through 29 will be a section. I'm going to read it all, and then we'll come back. For circumcision is indeed profitable if you keep the law. But if you're a breaker of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. Therefore, if an uncircumcised man keeps the righteous requirements of the law, will not his uncircumcision be counted as circumcision? And will not the physically uncircumcised, if he fulfills the law, judge you who even with your written code and circumcision are a transgressor of the law? For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly. And circumcision is that of the heart and the spirit and not in the letter, whose praise is not from men but from God. Well, let's go back to verse 25. Why does he use the terms circumcision and uncircumcision? To whom do those categories refer? Jews and Gentiles. That was the sign of the covenant with Abraham back in Genesis 17. And in other words, he's trying to discuss this with them. And so he says here, your circumcision is profitable if you keep the law. What does that mean if you don't keep the law? It's not profitable, has no benefit whatsoever. Now, for a Jew to hear that, that's almost striking at the very core of who he is. That was his identifying mark, his outward sign, if you will. And it differentiated them from the rest of the world. But he says, if you are a breaker of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. In other words, your differentiation from the world has disappeared. Now let me just for a moment try to use a little bit of more modern approach to this. If you are baptized, is that not only an act of obedience, but is that also a sign to the world that you have become a Christian? Yes. That's that marking line when you come to. Now, if I become a Christian and I am baptized, but I live like the world, what am I saying about my baptism? It meant nothing at all. In other words, it was just a formality that I might have gone through, but it did not have any significance to it. Well, if I am circumcised and I live contrary to the law, I'm a breaker of the law, he says your circumcision has become uncircumcision. But now notice verse 26. Therefore, if an uncircumcised man keeps the righteous requirements of the law, will not his uncircumcision be counted as circumcision? Is it possible there are some who are not God's chosen people, who are living better than God's chosen people? That's exactly correct. You go back up earlier when he talks about those who have the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness. These people who have by nature looked and said, you know, I need to live a better life. And I'm going to tell you what's sad is a lot of times there are people out there in the world who are not Christians who are living more godly lives than Christians are. And somebody says, well, then are you saying then that they are more righteous with God than a Christian who has been baptized? They're not more righteous because they've not been obedient to what God has given them to do. Because the big distinction is, under the Old Testament was a man who was not a Jew required to be baptized or required to be circumcised. If you were, but I mean, if he's were the people of Nineveh required to be circumcised? No, they weren't required to. But the difference is, in the New Testament, you are all required to be baptized. That's what everybody is commanded to do. So, I think what his real point is simply this. He's writing to the Jewish mind and he's trying to get them to understand you need the gospel because you've not lived faithful to the law that God gave you as Jews. These have, but he's trying to deal with the Jewish mindset. And so what he is doing, he's trying to explain to them that what you're doing, you've actually become an impediment, a stumbling block for people to become Christians because of your attitude of you don't need anything. Falling away is definitely possible. The Jews had fallen away. Okay, well, let's look at verses 27 through 29. And will not the physically uncircumcised, if he fulfills the law, judge you who are, even with your written code and circumcision, are a transgressor of the law? Notice he's talking about this uncircumcised fills the law versus the Jew who's a transgression. He says he is going to judge you. You go back to verse 1 and he says, who are you who judge another? How did the Jew view himself in looking at the Gentile? I'm God's chosen people, and I need to teach you, and I will judge you because I look at you, I look down on you. And here's what he's going to say when we get to chapter 3, which we will hear in just a few minutes, is the fact that you look at him and you judge him, and he can actually turn around and judge you because he can say, You're not living according to the law that God gave you. In much the same way earlier, he talked about those who would steal, those who would commit adultery, those who would rob temples. He said the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles. Can we live in such a way that the world looks back at us and say, well, if that's what it is, I don't want any of it? That's true. And that's what he's trying to impress upon them. Well, verse 28, this is something that I've got to imagine. If you're sitting there as a Jew, that's going to make you shake your head and say, what? He is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh. But he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart in the spirit, not in the letter, whose praise is not from men, but from God. You see, for them, everything was wrapped up in that physical act of being circumcised. And but does the Bible talk about the circumcision of the heart in the Old Testament? Absolutely. For just a minute, here's what I'd like for you to do. I want to go through some passages here. Let's go to the book of Deuteronomy. Let's go to chapter 10 and verse 16 first. And then we'll go to chapter 30 and verse 6. And then we'll go to, I'm going to skip some of these, Jeremiah chapter 4 and verse 4. Those three passages there, which I think will be enough to illustrate the point I'm trying to make. First of all, Deuteronomy 10 and verse 16. Therefore, circumcise the foreskin of your heart and be stiff-necked no longer. He's talking about the circumcision of the heart. Chapter 30, verse 6. And the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, that you may live. Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 4. Circumcise yourselves to the Lord, take away the foreskin of your hearts, you men of Judah, inhabitants of Jerusalem, lest my fury come forth like fire and burn so that no one can quench it because of the evil of your doings. Now, what he is doing here is, it's not just the physical act. God has said there's got to be also the spiritual act that goes with it. When we start talking about baptism, are we following the same pattern? Romans 4, 4 through 6. We are buried with him in baptism, raised to walk in newness of life. That represents the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. That is a physical act that we go through. But what does the Lord expect that physical act to represent in our lives? Death to sin, buried in baptism, raised to walk a new life. If I'm not walking a new life, maybe I didn't kill the old man to start with. You know, the book of Ephesians and the book of Colossians talk about put to death your members which are upon the earth. Paul said in Galatians 2 and verse 20, I have been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life which I now live by faith, I live in the Son. I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. It's a crucifixion of that old man. If I'm not raised to walk in newness of life, maybe I didn't crucify the old man. Yeah, that's what he's trying to do, is he's trying to point out to them, but he's also saying something else that I don't think some of them have really grasped. And that is, when you look at the Gentile, were there Gentiles who had more devout hearts, if you will, than some of the Jews did? Household of Cornelius. Let me just give you a really good illustration of it. Matthew chapter 8 and verse 10, which is parallel in Luke chapter 7, it says, here's the centurion whose son is sick. And you remember they went to him, and everybody, pleaded with him to say, come over and help his son. He's a good man. Even though he's a Gentile, he's a good man. And remember, he told the Lord, you don't need to come to my house. All you got to do is just say the word, and I know that'll be taken care of. And Jesus said, assuredly, I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. There's sometimes when Gentiles had exhibited greater faith, greater trust in God than some of God's own people have. And Cornelius is another example of someone who did. So what you have here, he's trying to get them to understand you're not just a Jew because you're one outwardly, but it's the one that's inward and not in the letter, but in the spirit. He's talking about the character of a man. So that's the reason why I titled this section, Honest Character. Does it matter what my character is? Absolutely it does. Well, verse 1 of chapter 3 really then has to focus our minds back to the way they're thinking. Because what Paul does here is to cause the Jew to question, well then, what advantage then has a Jew, or what is the profit in circumcision? You can imagine them saying, well then, what does it matter? What good does it do for us to be a Jew if there's no benefit to it whatsoever? What's the advantage? What's the profit? Well, there's three things that I think he's going to address in this first section. The first one is, what is the advantage of being a Jew? Number two, is God going to be faithful to his promises to us as Jews? And number three, if my sin gives God an opportunity to forgive and glorify himself, then why does God even want to punish my sin to begin with? Now, let's step back here and let's look first of all at this idea, what is the advantage or the profit? And before he answers this, what is the benefit of being a Jew? They are he said, much in every way, chiefly, first, foremost, because to them were committed the oracles of God. They had a written word, something that was objective and identifiable. How do I know whether or not a person has to be baptized or not? God's word. Now, if you had somebody who was coming around as an inspired apostle and he told you that, you'd know that's right. But what about generations that follow? The written word is objective. It's always something that you can appeal to and say, okay, here's what was written. We know this was written. We know it's true. We know this is from God. If you've got that written, you've got something you can appeal to. And so he's saying that you've got much in every way, but he says chiefly to the very first thing is because to them was committed the oracles of God. That's the most important part. But are there other benefits? How many of you were reared in Christian homes? Now, if you were reared in a Christian home, do you have a benefit that others don't have? Well, let me ask you another. You don't have to raise your hand. How many of you were reared in a home where your parents were teachers or really interested in education? You think about that. Or how many of you were reared in a home where you had a mother and a father? Not a single parent home. Or how many of you were reared by parents altogether instead of having to be reared in an orphan's home? Does that make any difference? Absolutely it does. You start out with things that others don't have. Does a Jew start out with blessings that other people don't have? He's been taught from the time he was a baby who he was, and God was his father. Does he have a benefit over a man who maybe, for instance, has been an idolater all of his life and now has learned the truth? And so what he's trying to do, he's trying to anticipate their question. What advantage then has a Jew? What is the profit of circumcision? He said, well, much in every way, chiefly because to them were committed the oracles of God. Now, let me add one other thing before I leave that point, because I think I can see some of that. Let's say, for instance, you're in a job and your boss comes along and he says to you, he says, we're going to give you a new title. And you say, that's a promotion. Good. What, does it come with any more money? No, it doesn't come with any more money. Does it come with any more responsibility? Do I get to supervise anybody else? No, you don't get to supervise anybody else. Well, then what do I get? Well, you get you a new title. Well, what good does it do then? What's the benefit of it? The Jew, after hearing that, might say, you know, we're a Jew, you call us a Jew, but what's the benefit of it? He's trying to say, yes, you do have benefit, you do have something, you just don't understand it right now. Well, no, them is the Jews. Chiefly to them, the Jews. Oh yeah, they were the prophets. You know, these were the men like Jeremiah, Isaiah, you know, Malachi. These are men that the God's word has been committed to them. They've given them the word of God. Let's look at objection number 2. For what if some did not believe? Will their unbelief make the faithfulness of God without effect? Now, in this position, in their minds, they're asking the question, well, if God is chosen us and some of our people didn't do what they were supposed to do, does that mean that God then will not keep his promises? Did God make promises to the children of Israel? Well, what if some people didn't do what God told them to do? Will God still keep his promise? He kept his promise because his promises were contingent. They were dependent upon the people doing what's right. All you got to do is read the book of Deuteronomy as the children of Israel, the new generation, is right there on the east side of the Jordan River, ready to cross over into the promised land with Joshua. And Moses recounts to them the fact that God has given you promises, but these promises are dependent upon the way you live once you go into the land. What if you choose to live like the people of the land? Going to spit you out just like it spit them out. And what will happen to you? God will send you away captive to another nation. In other words, you've got to understand these promises were dependent upon your response to them. So his question is, would it make the promises of God no effect? Well, that's not true. So verse 4 answers that, which says, there certainly not, or the King James says, God forbid. Let God be true, but every man a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and may overcome when you are judged. God is always going to be true to his word. I may, as a person, not be true to my word, but God's always going to do what he says he will do. And there's so many passages I can think of here. I think of Nehemiah chapter 9, verses 32 and 33, David, Psalm 51, verse 4, the conditional nature of God's promises. And did God know that some people were going to do what he had promised for them to do? Yeah, you remember Genesis 18, 19. God said, I have known him that he may command his children after him, that they may keep the commandments of the Lord, that God may bring upon him, that is Abraham, all the things that he's promised to him. So there were some people who were going to be faithful to it, but God has always kept his promises here. So he said that you may be justified in your words and may overcome when you are judged. God is always going to, when he's put to the test, is going to come out true. And if you've got an argument with God, who's the one on the wrong side? You are on the wrong side. Well, verse 5 is going to be the third question that was going to arise in their mind. But if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Is God unjust who inflicts wrath? I speak as a man. Notice he says, if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, God is then so good because he forgives my sin. He's good to me. Well, then if I can do that, then maybe I ought to just sin a whole lot so God can be more glorified. Well, that's what he goes on to say in verse 6. For certainly not, for then how will God judge the world? For if the truth of God has increased through my lie to his glory, why am I still judged a sinner? There's some people who have this mistaken idea that just because God is so gracious and every time God is so good to us, that the more I sin, that means his grace abounds, then maybe I'll just keep on sinning. That's chapter 6 and verse 1. What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Certainly not, or God forbid. We who died to sin, how shall we live any longer in it? So as I'm looking at these three supposed objections that the Jews would raise, shaking their heads, saying, well, what good is it to be a Jew then? Well, Paul is looking and saying, well, there's much in every way. And you're one who's been committed to the oracles of God, and he's going to say to them, you are the ones who have enjoyed all the blessings that God offers, but you should never take advantage of these offers here. That's probably about a good place for us to stop and begin our class here in verse 8 next week.